The murder of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey captivated the nation and put her family under the microscope, with many speculating that her father, mother, brother, or all three were involved in her killing.
How did you feel seeing her?
A lot of sadness. I don't think I really fully grasped, like, after this, I won't.
Shocking claim right up front. For nearly 3 decades, a web of contradictions, sealed records, and eyewitness accounts have led some investigators and insiders to argue that the official story of what happened in the Ramsey house on Christmas night 1996 was not the whole truth, and that the truth, if followed where it leads, points to a cover-up rather than a stranger who broke into the home. What follows is a careful, measured telling of the allegations, the evidence commonly cited by those who doubt the intruder theory, and the reasons many people remain unconvinced by the version of events that dominated headlines for years. Where those claims come from, how experts interpret the physical and behavioral evidence, and why the case remains unresolved are all part of a story that still shocks, unsettles, and prompts questions no single answer has yet satisfied. On January 8, 1997, a child psychologist sat down with a 9-year-old boy named Burke Ramsey. In that quiet, gently lit room, a standard clinical exercise turned into a document that would be replayed and reinterpreted for decades. According to the psychologist who reviewed recordings and notes from that session, Burke did not react in ways typical of a child who had lost a sibling to a violent crime. When asked if he missed his sister, his reply was terse, "I'm fine." Asked about his safety in the house where the crime occurred, he reportedly said he still felt safe. In a family drawing exercise, Burke allegedly omitted his sister entirely and placed his father distant from the rest of the family, his mother drawn small. At one point he told the psychologist, "I have a secret," and then refused to say more. These observations, described by multiple therapists as atypical for a traumatized child, became a focal point for those who would later question the official narrative. Years later, in 2016, Burke agreed to appear on national television. Analysts pored over his language and his expressions. Small hedges in his speech, moments where he seemed to deflect direct questions, and a tendency to smile in ways viewers found inappropriate were flagged by some experts as potential indicators of deception or emotional detachment. Others counseled caution, noting that social awkwardness can be misread as culpability, especially under intense media scrutiny. Either way, the pattern of Burke's responses, then and in earlier interviews, became part of an argument that the person closest to the scene might know more than he was saying. Those behavioral observations do not stand alone. Advocates of the intrafamily theory point to a cluster of physical evidence that, they argue, contradicts the timeline offered by the family on the morning of December 26, 1996. The autopsy report of the 6-year-old victim indicated fresh pineapple in her stomach, food that would have been eaten within 1 to 2 hours of death. Police photographs show a bowl of fresh pineapple on the Ramsey dining table. Reports circulated that Burke's fingerprints were found on the bowl while Patsy Ramsey's fingerprints were found on the spoon. If those details are accurate and unambiguous, they conflict with the assertion that the child had gone straight to bed after returning home from a Christmas gathering and never awoke. For many, the pineapple is one of the simplest, most persuasive pieces of physical evidence suggesting someone was with the child after the family claimed she had been put to bed. Other items found in the home drew suspicion because of their condition and placement. A heavy Maglite-style flashlight sat upright on the kitchen counter. Investigators later noted that the flashlight and even the batteries inside it had been wiped clean of fingerprints. Forensic specialists say a heavy cylindrical object like a flashlight could produce the kind of skull fracture found in the autopsy. In experiments conducted by third parties replicating the circumstances, strikes from an identical flashlight produced fracture patterns similar to those on the victim's skull. Critics of the intruder hypothesis ask, who would meticulously clean a flashlight of prints and then set it conspicuously on the counter as if to invite discovery? The same question arises with the ransom note, 3 pages written on the family notepad, demanding $118,000, the amount of the father's reported Christmas bonus. Analysts have said the paper and pen used belonged to the household, and handwriting comparisons have suggested similarities with family members. The note reads like a performance, elaborate and oddly specific to the family's finances. Taken together with the cleaned flashlight, the ransom note appears to proponents as staged evidence. The scene in the wine cellar where the child's body was found added layers of complexity. The young girl was discovered with her arms bound above her head, duct tape over her mouth, and a makeshift ligature in place. The stick later identified as a broken paintbrush handle that matched items from household art supplies. Autopsy findings included a devastating skull fracture, signs of sexual assault, and evidence of strangulation. Forensic experts disagree about the order of these injuries and what that order implies. Some argue the head injury was the initial, fatal blow and that other evidence was added to simulate an intruder's brutality. Others caution that reconstructing sequence is notoriously difficult and that the presence of certain materials in the body or nearby does not definitively prove a staged scene. Still, the presence of household items at the scene, the paintbrush handle, cord sourced from inside the home, is an important fact that cannot be ignored. The human context inside the household is another piece of the puzzle. Former staff members, most notably a housekeeper who later spoke publicly, reported numerous disturbing incidents prior to the child's death, episodes of aggression by the older sibling, smearings of feces on the younger child's belongings and walls, and physical assaults with objects such as golf clubs. Those accounts, if taken at face value, describe a pattern of escalating violence and targeted cruelty that would demand intervention. In several reports, staff members claim to have brought concerns to the parents, only to be dismissed or told to wait it out. Records cited by some investigators, school reports, sealed psychiatric evaluations, and emergency room notes have been described as containing references to prior injuries and behavioral issues. Many of these documents were sealed or are not publicly available, which in turn fuels suspicion and frustration among prosecutors and the public who want full transparency. Perhaps the most controversial and consequential set of allegations surrounds what supporters of the cover-up theory describe as an orchestrated, immediate campaign to control the narrative, not simply to grieve, but to manage every aspect of the family's public image and protect certain family members from scrutiny. Within hours of the discovery, attorneys and public relations consultants were reportedly on the scene. Friends and acquaintances moved through the house. Some items disappeared from the home. Contacts were made to media outlets, and press appearances were planned. Critics say that defensive legal counsel and the rapid engagement of crisis managers are sensible choices for any family facing tragedy, but others see that organization of resources as evidence of premeditation. If a family had something to hide, assembling skilled professionals would be an extremely effective way to shape early reports and influence the direction of an investigation. Law enforcement's role has come under sustained criticism as well. Investigators have acknowledged missteps in the handling of the initial scene. Early contamination, family members moving through rooms, the body being relocated before certain forensic examinations, the allowance of non-essential personnel into the house, complicated later analyses. Those procedural errors were exploited by the family's defense teams and public relations staff to cast doubt on any findings that suggested internal involvement. In later years, grand jury proceedings and interviews with former detectives and prosecutors revealed internal divisions. Some officers believed the evidence pointed inward, while others maintained that an intruder could not be ruled out. In 1999, a grand jury reportedly voted to indict the parents on charges related to child abuse resulting in death and being accessories, yet the district attorney declined to sign the indictments. That decision, and the reasons behind it, including political pressure and legal calculations, became another point of contention and sorrow for those who feel justice was delayed or denied. Secrecy has been a theme from early on. Medical records, therapy notes, and certain investigative documents were sealed by court order. Advocates for full disclosure argue that this secrecy served to shield the family and prevented independent scrutiny of the most relevant evidence. Those who oppose broader release emphasize privacy, the protection of minors, and the need for careful legal procedure. The tension between the public's demand for answers and the legal protections guaranteed to families and juveniles is central to why the case has remained in limbo. Colorado law at the time included protections for children under 10, which presented a legal challenge for anyone exploring criminal responsibility for a 9-year-old. Even with compelling evidence, prosecutors faced the practical reality that pursuing criminal charges against a child of that age would be legally constrained and politically fraught. The question of motive complicates the narrative further. Investigators and behavioral experts point to family dynamics that may have intensified rivalries and resentments. In this household, one child received considerable attention and resources for pageants and public appearances. The other, according to multiple accounts, lived largely outside that spotlight and showed signs of anger and acting out. Forensic psychologists describe how such imbalances, when combined with access to implements, obsessive behaviors around knots and tools, and unaddressed emotional problems, can create volatile situations. The behavioral pattern described by some staff, repetitive harassment, deliberate humiliation, and escalating physical aggression, is consistent with a household where harm to a child could have been enabled by neglect, denial, or a failure to seek intervention. Even with all these elements, there are unresolved questions and alternate explanations that demand consideration. DNA and trace evidence found on underwear and clothing have been cited by others to suggest contact with an unknown adult male, and manufacturing or secondary transfer of DNA complicates interpretation. Some analysts maintain that the ransom note and other staging could have been the work of a disturbed outsider seeking to mimic or manipulate the family narrative. The intruder theory, though challenged by many physical inconsistencies, still has supporters who argue that pieces of the evidence cannot be fully reconciled with a family-only theory. Law enforcement officers who remain skeptical of the intra-family explanation have pointed out how contaminated crime scenes and inconsistent witness accounts make firm conclusions difficult. The truth may be messy and certainty elusive. One of the harder questions is why, if a cover-up occurred, it proved so effective for so long. Money and influence provide tools, access to legal counsel, public relations strategy, and the ability to pressure local institutions. In high-profile cases, those tools can skew public perception and institutional responses. But wealth alone cannot erase physical clutter. Pineapple in a stomach, fibers on a knife, splinters consistent with a household paintbrush. What wealth and influence can do is buy time, shape narratives, and complicate legal paths to prosecution. They can also cultivate a media environment in which curiosity and rumor proliferate, drowning out forensic nuance. This is part of why the case became a cultural flashpoint. It raised questions about power, privilege, and whether justice is equally applied. Another layer is the psychological cost for those who worked in the household and for witnesses who came forward. People who tried to raise concerns were sometimes silenced by settlements, intimidated by anonymous threats, or simply not believed. The psychological burden of witnessing harm and feeling complicit by inaction has weighty moral and emotional consequences. Some witnesses who eventually spoke said they were motivated by conscience and age. Decades later, unwilling to be the last keeper of a secret, they stepped forward with their accounts. Their testimonies have been valuable for private investigators and journalists trying to piece together a fuller picture, but sealed records and legal obstacles have limited what can be presented in court. Forensic re-examination has been a mixed blessing. New techniques developed since 1996 can extract more from old evidence, but they are also often constrained by the condition and integrity of that evidence. Items moved, cleaned, or handled before proper collection reduce the probability of definitive results. Retesting can confirm some matches, raise new questions, or simply produce inconclusive results that reopen debates. For those who study the case, certain physical clues, the pineapple, the flashlight, the paint splinters, the knot patterns, remain compelling pieces of a puzzle. For others, those same clues are shortcuts to a narrative that might oversimplify the many unknowns. What about accountability? Criminal law and the passage of time pose real barriers. Prosecution requires evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. When key witnesses die, records remain sealed, and a child suspected of involvement was below the age of criminal culpability at the time, the legal system faces practical and ethical limits. Civil avenues might exist but require a different standard of proof and often hinge on available records and the willingness of parties to litigate. In the end, the system can fail victims by design, through secrecy and politics, or by accident through investigative error and human limitation. That failure is why public debate persists and why documentaries, books, and investigative journalists continue to re-examine the evidence. There is a final moral dimension to consider. Whatever one concludes about the evidence and the competing theories, a 6-year-old girl died in a brutal way. The human cost is absolute. Families are forever altered, witnesses are burdened, and a community is left with questions. Many observers are not satisfied with merely declaring an official position. They seek systemic lessons, better protection for children, more rigorous handling of crime scenes, clearer policies around sealed records in cases of alleged child abuse, and improved mechanisms to prevent conflicts of interest from influencing investigations. Those are reforms that could produce justice in future cases regardless of how this particular story is ultimately interpreted. This narrative is not intended as a verdict. It is a careful retelling of allegations, evidence, and conflicting interpretations that have kept this case alive in the public conscience for decades. Some investigators and private analysts argue that the pieces fit together in a way that points to an intra-family tragedy and a subsequent cover-up. Others insist that the evidence is contaminated, ambiguous, and insufficient to justify such a conclusion. What is clear, though, is that the questions raised by behavioral analyses, forensic anomalies, sealed documents, and rapid public relations interventions are not easily dismissed. If you are listening or watching with an open mind, consider 3 practical things. Read primary source material where possible, understand the difference between allegation and proof, and keep in mind how legal protections for minors and the integrity of investigations create both necessary safeguards and frustrating obstacles. The quest for truth is rarely straightforward, and the more high the stakes, the more urgent it is that claims be examined carefully, compassionately, and honestly. Whatever your view, the death of a child is a call for scrutiny, for better protection of vulnerable people, and for insisting that institutions answer honestly and fully when the public demands accountability. For many, this case is a reminder that access to power can distort justice. For others, it is a caution about rushing to judgment when evidence remains ambiguous. Until sealed records are opened, until all witnesses can be heard under oath, and until forensic analysis can be conducted in a transparent, unimpeachable manner, the JonBenét Ramsey story will remain a painful knot in American true crime history. A case that compels us to ask what we owe to victims, to families, and to the truth itself.